The original idea for this project came from our brilliant character designer on the film, Shannon Tyndall. I'd worked with Shannon about 10 years ago on Coraline, the first film that we made at the studio. He was one of our key character designers. And even at that time, going back to when we first met each other, I was really impressed by his eye for detail, his design sensibilities. But he also had a really fertile mind. And so when he called me up, it was a little over 5 years ago, and he said he had a number of projects that he wanted to pitch to the studio that he thought might make decent films. And there was one of them in particular that got me really excited, and that was the idea that eventually became Kubo and the Two Strings. And the thing that excited me about it, what that really drew me to it, was it really tapped into a number of different things that I've loved since I was a kid. When I was a boy, I devoured epic fantasies. I absolutely adored them. Everything by C.S. Lewis and L. Frank Baum and Lewis Carroll. But above all, J.R.R. Tolkien was at the top of that heap. And it really was a gift from my mother. In fact, when my mom was pregnant with me and when she was recovering in the hospital after I was born, she was reading Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. So in a very real way, these things have been a part of my life since the day I took my first breath. It was one of the first great gifts that my mom bestowed upon me. And my dad, for his part, he gave me a very different gift, but one that was just as important. When I was around 8 years old, he let me tag along on one of his business trips to Japan. And I grew up in Portland, Oregon. And from the moment I set foot in Japan, it really was like I'd been transported to another world. It was just so beautiful and breathtaking and almost otherworldly. And the whole experience was a revelation for me. And so this film is effectively the convergence of those two things. It's a love of fantasy that I got from my mom, a love of the transcendent art of Japan that I got from my dad, all bound together in a film that's about the sustaining love of family. It's a film inspired by family, about family.
As you guys now are using stop motion, but also CGI and computer generated animation, how do you say, okay, this is going to be this or that's going to be that, and how much of that shifts throughout production, and how do you keep your thumb on the budget and the time and
Like, really? How? Okay.
how do you do what you do?
That is a good question. I think we were, as a studio, not really ready for this movie until now. So we've been here for 10 years. All of these incredible people have been here, all along. And I think Travis especially was looking for a really big, epic action adventure, something we could sink our teeth into. And it wasn't until maybe 5 years ago that we're ready to do it. And so there were a lot of things that were really worrisome about it. It was a big outdoor action adventure with this huge scale. And of course we shoot on, tabletops, like desks inside a warehouse in the dark. So that was challenging. There's tons of water. There's different kinds of characters that we hadn't tackled before. But we have learned so much through the different kinds of movies that we've done before. And the whole group, of creative collaborators are really here with us this whole time. So once we learn one thing, okay, we know that we can put that into our library of things that we know how to do, and we can tackle something new. And so at that point, we were ready, but terrified. How do we decide to shoot in camera? I think we always want to shoot in camera as much as we can, because it will look whole. It'll look like a movie. It'll look, more beautiful. And, as you travel through a movie like this where you've got like 80 different locations, maybe, you want to make sure that it looks apart, that the world looks really whole and made of one hand. And I think we try to do everything in camera, and that which we cannot do in camera, we turn to our visual effects department. Our visual effects department is like these guys here with us at the very beginning. It's not something that we decide to do at the end of the movie, like a post-production thing, afterthought. They work and collaborate with these guys, with all of us from the beginning. And so we're more, easily able to tackle things. And we also do things really differently. It's not like... it's not necessarily traditional the way you might do it in another movie. So we have a few tricks up our sleeves.
Georgia, puppet fabrication supervisor. I'm assuming that means you supervise all the manufacturing of the puppets. How do you even begin to figure out what the materials are that you're going to use?
It all starts at the beginning of the film. So we have an amazing production designer who is researching the look of the entire movie. And actually a lot of the influence across the board of the movie was taken from origami, paper folding, the simple graphic lines of paper folding. So when it came down to us having to make puppets out of origami, we did the same thing. We went to another level of research. I had a small team of people who had been making stop motion traditional puppets up until that point, but we had a lot of visual reference. We tackled all of the characters firstly in traditional origami. We had a woman that came in and she did all of the maquettes in paper in origami, and it was then our job to work out how on earth we were going to make this able to withstand an animator touching it, let alone animating it for a year. So we went through material development, and we also sort of went through deconstructing paper folding origami techniques to then reconstruct them into a movable, workable puppet. So each of our origami characters had metal armatures underneath the paper. It was a combination of hard parts which were covered in the paper. And I say paper, we couldn't use paper. The first puppet that we sent out there with a little bit of paper on just tore up instantly. So we actually ended up using Tyvek, which commonly in the building trade and in the suits that people go into laboratories in. It looks like paper, but it has this amazing tear strength. You can't tear it. You also can't paint it very easily. So that was a bit of, the thing with puppet making, the fun of it is you have a problem put in front of you or, a creative challenge, and that's what it's all about. How are we going to figure this out? And visual effects helped as well, but only to a small degree. A lot of what you're seeing out there is practical, and it was a lot of the animators informing us what they needed to turn a flat piece of paper into a three-dimensional origami character.
Fantastic. And I assume that you must have worked very closely with Deborah, because at the same time that you're creating these puppets, which seems like too simple a word to be using, sorry, but how do you begin to figure out not only what these characters should look like, but whether the practicality of that is going to work out?
There's a lot of research done at the beginning on the engineering of the costumes, as much as the history of the character and the history of the film, the Japanese history of the film that we looked into as well. But following on from what George said about origami informing a lot of the characters, we also used that as a jumping off point for how the costumes were going to work, as the kimonos are mainly flat, wide shapes that are just wrapped and tied to bodies, and they're not tailored, which we've been used to making. They're used to being fitted to the armature. And how do we control all of those folds? So looking at origami just as a jumping off point, but also looking at Issey Miyake's designs, who created folded clothing that just is very elegant over a body and follows the form of a body, using those as inspiration. It's how we were going to make those graphic lines a language for the film that travel between the characters. So a lot of our costumes now have their own engineering underneath, and they pretty much have their own armatures at this point, especially in this film, and especially with the sister's character, to control those folds. There's a lot of engineering underneath that we've developed over the course of time in our costume making for Leica, where we learn one thing or trick, as you might want to call it, on one film and one costume, but we can reinterpret that and use that in a different area on others. So it's a culmination of those things. So there's several materials under those costumes, including Tyvek, to make the wrinkled surface. They have weighted linings made with tungsten and nickel powder and glue that is laser cut to create the gravity in the scale and the kind of dimpled surface of old silk, and then armatures to control the flow of the sleeves.
So Brian, Director of Rapid Prototyping. I love that title. I don't mean to make fun of it at all. I'm sure that there was a lot of thought into coming up with that title. So explain, first of all, what that is and how that interfaces with, for the layman.
So basically, what we do at Leica for facial animation is we are combining about a 100-year-old technique of replacement animation with 21st century 3D printing technology. This is something we started over a decade ago on Coraline, and we were the first studio to ever try this crazy idea. And essentially what it is instead of hand sculpting different facial expressions that an animator would then be putting on a puppet and taking a frame of film and then replacing that expression with another hand-sculpted face. We thought, could we actually do that in the computer? Probably one of the best examples of replacement animation before Coraline would have been Jack Skellington in Nightmare Before Christmas. And he had about 800 facial expressions for the entire film. So our original goal was, hey, we're going to be able to produce 800 faces pretty quick using this 3D printer. So back on Coraline, we were producing these faces out of a plastic printer that then we needed to go in and actually individually hand paint every single face. So we were really pushing the performance of these characters to unseen areas, but we were still really having to dial back the sophistication of how their paint jobs could look. On Paranorman, we started looking at different types of 3D printing technology, which is started looking at color 3D printed technology. And we were using that and have used that since Paranorman, Box Trolls, and we use that for the human characters on Kubo. But one of the downsides to this powder color printing that we were using, it was really hard to get fine feature detail. So when we were seeing the early on character designs for Kubo and the Two Strings, there were 3 characters in particular that were very nerve-wracking for us. So the monkey character with her fur, Beetle with his hard facets on his face, and then the Moon Beast character at the end, that serpent. And it was the first time in my career that we were at a crossroads that I either had to go back to the director and say, hey, our technology that we're using isn't going to be able to complete your vision, or do we find a new way to do it? And the amazing thing about the last 10 years of Leica and the rapid prototyping process is not only had we made a name for ourselves in the 3D printing world, or excuse me, in the animation world, we'd also made a pretty good name for ourselves in the 3D printing world. We had an opportunity to reach out to some of these companies and say, all right, what do you guys have in beta testing? What do you guys have in machines that you haven't released to the public yet? Is there any way that we can actually tap into that and see if that would help us help deliver Travis's look for Moon Beast and Monkey and Beetle? And it was a perfect scenario that there was a plastic 3D printer that was in the works with a company called Stratasys. We had an opportunity to go to this 3D printing company and say, hey, we love your hardware, but let us develop the software. Let us be the ones who figure out how we can take a face, put paint on it, or put 3-dimensional paint on it, and then send it to one of these plastic printers. And it worked out really well. It was not without a lot of hard work from a lot of very dedicated people that we were basically trailblazing a completely new way of producing plastic color printed faces.
Thank you very much, and thank you for staying.
Yeah.
Thank you.